fluorescent hum of the mess hall during lockdown was a constant low thrum against my skull, a fitting soundtrack to my general discontent. The air, recycled and stale, tasted faintly of overbrewed coffee and yesterday's industrial cleaner. I'd been stuck here for 3 days, waiting out some local bureaucratic snafu that had shuttered the entire facility. My current project, a rather uninspired redesign of a municipal building, lay stalled, and my patience, already a thin veneer, was wearing dangerously thin. I stared at the chipped linoleum table, tracing a phantom crack with my finger, wishing I were anywhere else. My phone, usually a reliable source of professional headaches, buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, figuring it was another contractor with another excuse. But something in the persistent vibration caught my attention. I answered, my voice clipped. Grant here. A pause, then a voice, smooth and formal, like old leather. Mr. Grant, this is the executor for the estate of Elara Vance. Elara Vance. The name hung in the air, dusty and forgotten. My great-aunt. I hadn't seen or spoken to her in, well, decades. My parents had always referred to her as eccentric in hushed tones, a polite euphemism for unhinged and best avoided. My pragmatic mind had long since filed her away in the mental drawer labeled distant relatives, irrelevant. Yes, I prompted, my tone betraying no interest. My gaze drifted to the reinforced windows of the mess hall, showing nothing but a gray, featureless sky. I regret to inform you, Mr. Grant, that your great-aunt, Elara Vance, passed away last Tuesday. Another pause. I felt nothing. Not a flicker of sorrow, not even surprise. Elara had always seemed ancient, even in the blurry photographs from my childhood. He was a ghost already. I see, I said, my voice flat. My condolences, I suppose. Indeed. However, there's a rather unexpected development. Ms. Vance, in her final will and testament, named you as the sole inheritor of her estate. My eyebrows lifted. This was certainly unexpected. Elara had a reputation for hoarding, for living off the grid in that isolated corner of New England. I imagined a cluttered, ramshackle cottage, maybe a few dusty antiques. Her estate? What exactly does that entail? The executor cleared his throat, a dry rustle. Blackwood Manor, and its surrounding lands. All assets, personal effects, etc. Blackwood Manor. The name struck a discordant note, like a forgotten chord. I remembered whispers, fragments from childhood. A vast, sprawling place, deep in the woods, far from anywhere. A place parents warned their children about. Blackwood Manor? I repeated, a new note of skepticism entering my voice. Are you certain? I haven't had contact with Elara since I was a child. Quite certain, Mr. Grant. The will is explicit. You are her last living relative of direct lineage. The executor's tone shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible dip into something less formal, more cautionary. The property, as you may know, is rather remote and has been uninhabited, save for Ms. Vance, for many years. It will require considerable attention. Considerable attention was legal speak for a money pit. I was an architect. I knew old buildings, and I knew the kind of problems an ancient, isolated estate in a forgotten corner of New England would present. This wasn't a windfall. It was a burden. I'll need to see the will, I stated, already picturing the legal paperwork, the surveys, the endless frustrating details. My mind, ever the problem solver, began to categorize. Structural issues, environmental hazards, deferred maintenance. A project, yes, but one I hadn't asked for. Of course, I can arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. The property is located in the town of Havenwood, just off Route 113. It's quite secluded. The locals, well, they tend to keep to themselves out there. The locals. That was another red flag. When people started talking about the locals in that particular tone, it usually meant a place had a reputation, not for friendly bake sales, but for something far less palatable. My cynicism, usually a shield, felt a little thin around the edges. "Right," I said, picking up a pen and absently jotting down the address on a napkin. "Havenwood. I'll be in touch." I hung up, the abrupt click echoing in the unnerving quiet of the mess hall. Blackwood Manor. The name resonated with an odd weight. I could almost feel the cold, damp air of the place, smell the must of aged wood and forgotten things. It wasn't a pleasant sensation. I had always prided myself on my pragmatism, my ability to strip away sentiment and see things for what they truly were: concrete, steel, and bottom lines. It hinted at history, at secrets, at something that had waited patiently for its next occupant. And now, apparently, that was me. My great-aunt Elara. The name still felt foreign on my tongue, a distant echo from a forgotten branch of the family tree. I'd always prided myself on my pragmatism, my ability to strip away sentimentality and see the cold, hard facts. Blackwood Manor, however, felt less like a fact and more like a looming shadow. The lawyer's voice, clipped and efficient, had painted a picture of a sprawling, isolated relic, and my mind, ever the architect, had immediately begun sketching out renovation plans, a defense mechanism against the unsettling truth of a sudden, unexpected inheritance from a woman I barely knew. The drive north was a descent into an older, quieter world. The highway thinned, then dissolved into a network of winding, tree-lined roads that seemed to shrink with every mile. The cell service, my last tether to the familiar, flickered and died somewhere after the last gas station, a lonely beacon of fading neon. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Finally, the lane. My tires crunched over loose gravel and fallen twigs, the only sound for what felt like miles. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, it appeared. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just big, it was monumental. Gabled roofs rose to sharp, angular peaks, like the shoulders of some ancient, weary beast. The grandeur was undeniable, a testament to a bygone era of wealth and ambition, but it was a grandeur in profound decay. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, the weight of it feeling insignificant compared to the weight of the house. The massive oak front door, scarred and weathered, groaned open with a reluctant, drawn-out shriek that sent a flock of startled birds exploding from the eaves. Inside, a cavernous entrance hall stretched before me, dimly lit by the dying light filtering through the grimy fanlight above the door. The air hit me first, a thick, cloying cocktail of damp earth, stagnant air, and something else. A faint metallic tang, like old pennies, mixed with the cloying sweetness of forgotten potpourri. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. A grand staircase, its balustrade intricately carved but coated in a uniform layer of dust, swept upwards into the gloom. Dust sheets draped over unseen furniture in the flanking rooms, creating an army of ghostly forms. I told myself it was just an old house. Old houses creaked, they groaned, they settled. The kitchen was a relic, a vast space with an ancient, rusting range and a pantry that smelled faintly of mice and mildew. The dining room was equally grand, a long table hidden beneath a sheet, its chairs spectral sentinels. I found what looked like a study or a library towards the back of the house, away from the main thoroughfare. This room, unlike the others, felt less abandoned, more recently vacated. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of lavender and old paper lingered. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cleared save for a single leather-bound book. It wasn't a book, not really. It was a journal, its cover worn smooth, the edges frayed. The title, or rather the name Elara Blackwood, was embossed in faded gold script. My great aunt. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I hadn't expected to find anything so personal. My fingers traced the raised letters, the leather cool and dry beneath my touch. I opened it. The pages, yellowed and brittle, were filled with a spidery, elegant handwriting that grew progressively more erratic as I flipped through. The early entries were mundane enough. Observations on the garden, notes on local weather, lists of errands. But then, a shift. October 14th. The wind sings tonight, a strange melody. I hear it in the eaves, in the very walls. It is almost. They are not just the wind. They speak of secrets, of old agreements. I feel watched, even in my own home. My brow furrowed. Agreements? I tried to rationalize it. An old woman, alone in a massive house, perhaps a touch of senility. But the tone, the increasing urgency in the ink strokes, suggested something more. December 1st. I know now. It is the pact. They demand something, always something. The house remembers, the woods remember, they want their due. December 17th. They are everywhere. They speak of my ancestors, of the bargain made beneath the Blackwood trees. I cannot escape their voices. I am trapped. The last word was blood. I closed the journal slowly, the leather cool against my palm. The subtle creaks and groans that had been background noise suddenly seemed to take on a new, more sinister meaning. They weren't just the house settling. They were the house speaking. I closed the journal slowly, the leather cool against my palm. The silence in the room, which I had moments ago dismissed as merely the quiet of an old, empty house, now pressed in on me, heavy and alive. The subtle creaks and groans that had been background noise suddenly seemed to take on a new, more deliberate rhythm, as if the house itself was breathing, or watching. The words of the journal, Elara's desperate plea, echoed in my head. The woods demand. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the bare floorboards, a sound that seemed to tear at the oppressive quiet. I needed air. I needed distance from the suffocating history contained within those pages, within these walls. The rational part of me, the part that dealt in blueprints and structural integrity, scoffed at the notion of sentient woods or demanding entities. Stepping out onto the back veranda, the crisp New England air was a welcome shock. The grounds were a testament to decades of neglect. Choked flower beds, a crumbling stone path swallowed by moss, and beyond it all, the woods. They weren't like any woods I'd ever seen. Even from a distance, they felt different. No birds sang from those branches. No squirrels chittered. My feet, almost without conscious thought, started down the dilapidated path, crunching on fallen leaves and brittle twigs. The air grew cooler as I approached the tree line, losing the last warmth of the setting sun. The path, once perhaps a carriage drive, dwindled to a barely discernible track, hemmed in by grasping brambles and skeletal branches. I pushed through a curtain of ivy, and suddenly, I was inside. The difference was immediate, palpable. The light was a murky, bruised green, filtered through layers of ancient, moss-draped branches. The ground was soft with centuries of leaf litter, muffling my footsteps. The air was heavy, damp, carrying the scent of rich, decaying earth and something else. Something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood. And then I heard it. At first, I dismissed it as the wind. A low sigh, a rustle of leaves. But it was too sustained, too close. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound that seemed to be all around me, yet nowhere specific. A faint, distorted murmur, like a dozen voices speaking at once, just beyond the edge of hearing. Fragmented, indistinct, like snippets of conversation caught through a thick wall. My heart gave a jolt. I stopped, straining my ears, turning my head slowly from side to side. The sound would swell, then recede, a tide of hushed, unintelligible words. It played tricks on my perception, making the very air feel alive with unseen presences. But the sound was undeniably there. I pressed deeper, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake. They clawed at the edges of my sanity, making me feel exposed, vulnerable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of an unseen creature sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Then, the woods shifted. The green light seemed to flicker, and the air grew thick, not with the damp scent of earth, but with something sterile, metallic. The earthy floor became slick, stained linoleum. I was no longer in the woods. My vision swam. I was standing in a vast, echoing space, fluorescent lights buzzing harshly overhead. Long, empty tables stretched into the gloom, scarred by countless meals. The air was thick with the lingering smell of stale food and antiseptic. A distant, rhythmic clang echoed like metal on metal. Just as quickly as it came, it vanished. I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands flying up as if to ward off a physical blow. My breath hitched in my throat. What the hell was that? A hallucination? A memory? My mind was playing cruel tricks on me, already unraveling. I gripped a nearby tree trunk, its rough bark digging into my palm, grounding me. I forced myself to move forward, needing to understand, needing to find something tangible to explain the unsettling feeling, the disturbing vision. And then I saw it. It stood apart from the other trees, even older, more twisted. A colossal oak, its trunk wider than a car, its branches gnarled and contorted like arthritic fingers reaching towards the bruised sky. As I drew closer, the details emerged from the gloom. Carved into the ancient wood, crude yet deliberate, were symbols. Not initials or casual graffiti, but intricate, unsettling patterns. Circles within circles, jagged lines that resembled stylized lightning bolts, and abstract shapes that looked vaguely like distorted human figures. Or perhaps skeletal animals. Some were deep, clearly ancient, almost smoothed over by time and weather. Others looked newer, sharper, as if etched recently. There were 7 distinct symbols, arranged in a rough circle around the base of the trunk, each about the size of my hand. These weren't random. These were ritualistic. I couldn't make out words, but the intent was clear. It was a chorus of demand, a hungry, ancient sound that spoke of sacrifice and pacts. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the undeniable sensation of being watched, not just by the unseen things in the woods, but by the tree itself. It felt like a living monument, a sentinel. They waited. More sinister meaning. I pulled my hand back as if burned, the chill from the leather seeping into my bones. The silence was no longer empty, but expectant, a held breath. I stood there for a long moment, listening, my breath shallow. The house shifted around me, a series of soft groans from the timbers, a whisper of wind through a loose pane somewhere upstairs. My pragmatic mind, the one that designed steel and glass towers, tried to rationalize it all away. Old house, old wood, old pipes. I picked up Elara's journal again, careful this time, as if it might bite. I needed to understand what I'd just read. The entry about the bargain and the sacrifice churned in my mind. It was the only room I'd managed to make somewhat functional, with a single working lamp and a slightly less broken chair. I brewed a strong, bitter coffee, my third of the night, and spread the journal on the scarred kitchen table. The pages, brittle and yellowed, rustled under my fingers. Elara's elegant script, which had initially seemed merely eccentric, now felt like the frantic scrawl of someone teetering on the edge. I began to read, not just the last entry, but flipping back through the years, searching for a pattern. It didn't take long for the threads to appear, just as the leaves turned and the days shortened. She wrote of other family members, distant cousins and great uncles I'd never heard of, all succumbing to various forms of melancholy or unfortunate accidents. One entry, dated nearly 60 years prior, caught my eye. Cousin Eleanor, found by the creek. They said she slipped, but I saw the mark. The word mark was underlined 3 times, almost gouged into the paper. Another, 2 decades later. Uncle Silas the rope. Always so cheerful until the autumn mists came. The house took him. I know it. My stomach tightened. I remembered the lawyer's dry recital of Elara's own demise. A fall from the attic window. An accident. But was it? My eyes scanned the kitchen, the familiar geometry of the appliances, the worn linoleum. I needed more. Elara had mentioned the old records in passing. I remembered a locked chest in the corner of the library, tucked under a dusty tapestry. I'd assumed it was old silverware or forgotten trinkets. I found the chest, a heavy, iron-bound thing. The key was on Elara's ring, the one the lawyer had given me. It turned with a grating protest. Inside, instead of heirlooms, were stacks of brittle ledgers and leather-bound diaries, some so old the ink had faded to ghost gray. I dragged the chest back to the relative safety of the kitchen lamp, the metallic clang echoing too loudly in the quiet house. For hours, I delved into the faded script of generations long past. His son, a quiet scholar, had suffered from visions and fits of despair before taking his own life in the manor's attic in November. It wasn't just mental decline. There were mentions of strange fevers, sudden wasting diseases, unexplained disappearances, and a horrifying number of accidents. Falls, drownings, hunting mishaps, all concentrated in the same late autumn and early winter months. A grim tapestry of madness and death, woven through the lineage of Blackwood Manor. My eyes burned, the words blurring on the page. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the fog. That's when it happened. A wave of nausea washed over me, disorienting. The smell of old paper and dust vanished, replaced by something metallic, vaguely antiseptic, and the cloying scent of stale, institutional food. I wasn't sitting in Elara's kitchen anymore. A sickly, yellowish glow pulsed from some unseen source, barely illuminating a vast, echoing space. The air was thick with a strange, metallic tang, and a low, guttural murmur seemed to vibrate through the very floor. The room stretched out, cavernous and stark, filled with rows of empty, scarred tables bolted to the floor. The ceiling was a network of exposed pipes and harsh, recessed lighting. Heavy steel doors, scored with scratches and dents, punctuated the walls, each one looking impossibly thick, impossibly secure. A clatter of unseen trays echoed from an alcove, followed by a harsh, mechanical clang. The low murmur intensified, not voices, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very foundations of this place. I was trapped. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if all sound, all movement was being actively suppressed. This wasn't just a room, it was a cage, and I was in it. My breath hitched. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the yellow light dissolved. The stale, metallic smell receded. I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and snapped back to the kitchen. The fluorescent light was buzzing again, steady and defiant. The old ledger was open before me, the scent of dust and ancient paper filling my nostrils. I stared, heart still thudding, at the single working lamp. Had the power just flickered? Had I drifted off, exhausted? But the vividness of it, the sheer sensory overload of that brief, terrifying shift, was impossible to dismiss as a mere dream. It had felt too real, too immediate. A waking nightmare. I ran a trembling hand over my face. The fear, a knot in my stomach, was real. Blackwood Manor wasn't just revealing its secrets. It was actively reaching for me, twisting my perceptions. The ancestors hadn't just gone mad in this house. They had been driven mad, slowly, meticulously, by something that lived within its walls, something that was now beginning to work on me. And I was trapped, just like they had been, deep in the heart of its demanding time. My eyes scanned the kitchen, the familiar geometry of the appliances, the worn wooden cabinets that had seen generations of hands. I pushed Elara's journal further away, its worn leather cover radiating an almost physical cold. The coffee in my mug was truly cold now, a bitter film across its surface. It was all too much, this sudden deluge of the inexplicable. I was an architect, a man of blueprints and structural integrity. Ghosts and ancient pacts belonged in cheap paperbacks, not in my life, and certainly not in the foundations of a house I was supposed to restore. But the house felt different. The air had a weight to it, a subtle pressure against my eardrums. I could hear the usual creaks and groans of an old structure settling, but now they seemed to arrange themselves into something more deliberate. A low, drawn-out sigh from the floorboards above. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across plaster from behind the pantry wall. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind. I stood, the chair scraping loudly on the flagstone floor, a sharp, unwelcome sound in the sudden quiet. I needed a distraction, something concrete. I headed for the library, intending to sort through the chaos of Elara's neglected books, perhaps find some old architectural texts. As I passed the grand staircase, a sudden, inexplicable gust of icy air swept down from the upper landing, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the mild indoor temperature. It wasn't a draft. The heavy velvet curtains hung still. I paused, listening. Nothing. Just the continued, almost rhythmic groaning of the old house. My pragmatic mind scrambled for an explanation. Faulty insulation, a structural anomaly creating air currents. But my gut churned with a primal unease that defied logic. I made it to the library, the high ceilings and dusty shelves offering little comfort. I reached for a heavy, leather-bound volume, something on local history, hoping to ground myself in facts. As my fingers brushed the spine, the book next to it, a slender, unmarked tome, slid silently from the shelf and landed on the floor with a soft thud. It hadn't fallen. It had moved. It lay open, face down, on the Persian rug. A shiver traced its way down my spine. It was blank. Every page empty. I slammed it shut, a sudden spike of anger overriding the creeping fear. This was ridiculous. I was tired, stressed. My mind was playing tricks. "All right," I muttered, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. Enough. I decided then and there. I needed to leave. Just for a few hours. Drive into town, get a proper meal, maybe even stay the night at a motel. Clear my head. I wasn't going mad. I just needed some distance. I walked with purpose towards the front door, my boots echoing on the polished wood floors. The house seemed to resist my departure. The air grew heavier with each step, like wading through thick water. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, not just settling, but protesting. It wasn't words, not yet. Just a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, or sand sifting through a sieve. I reached the massive oak front door, its brass handles cool beneath my touch. As I turned the handle, a violent shudder ran through the entire structure. The chandelier above me swayed wildly, its crystals clinking like frantic chimes. Leave. My hand froze on the handle. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't old house noises. This was real. Suddenly, the familiar grandeur of the foyer warped. The rich wood paneling dissolved into grimy concrete, the ornate chandelier replaced by flickering fluorescent tubes. The air, heavy with dust and the scent of old wood, was abruptly replaced by the metallic tang of disinfectant and stale sweat. I was standing in a long, low-ceilinged room, stark and institutional. Rows of identical scarred tables stretched before me, bolted to the floor, each with a single hard plastic chair. The windows were high and barred, letting in only slivers of gray light. A low, indistinguishable murmur of voices filled the air, a constant hum that grated on my nerves. The sense of being watched, of being utterly, completely trapped, was overwhelming. My lungs seized up. This wasn't Blackwood Manor. This was a prison, a bleak, inescapable cage, and I was one of the hushed, anonymous figures confined within it. You belong to us. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the illusion shattered. The concrete walls rippled, reforming into the familiar, decaying wallpaper of Blackwood Manor's foyer. The scent of old disinfectant vanished, replaced by the persistent damp earth smell of the house. My knees buckled. I leaned heavily against the doorframe, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. What in God's name was that? A hallucination? A waking nightmare? Or had the house, the thing in the house, shown me my future? I couldn't. The house wasn't just responding to me, it was claiming me. I was trapped. And the determined, pragmatic man I thought I was felt utterly, hopelessly lost. I was trapped. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my hands still numb from the impact of the unyielding wood. The silence of Blackwood Manor pressed in, thick and suffocating. It wasn't an empty silence. It hummed with a low, almost imperceptible thrum, like a vast hidden mechanism slowly grinding. Panicking wouldn't help. I was an architect. I solved problems. This was a problem, albeit one of a profoundly unsettling nature. If the house wouldn't let me out, then I had to understand why. And the only way to do that was to delve deeper, to uncover whatever festering secret lay at its core. My great-aunt Elara's letters, her fragmented warnings, the unsettling dreams, they all pointed to something ancient, something buried. I moved through the echoing halls, not with my previous cautious curiosity, but with a new, grim resolve. My flashlight beam cut through the deepening gloom, each dust mot dancing like a spectral mote. I found myself drawn, almost unconsciously, towards the older sections of the house, the parts that felt like they predated even the earliest records I'd found. The servants' quarters, a warren of cramped, forgotten rooms, seemed a likely candidate for hidden truths. I pushed open a heavy, unpainted door that groaned on its hinges, revealing a vast, cavernous space. It was unlike any other room I'd seen in the manor. Bare stone walls, streaked with damp, rose to a high, vaulted ceiling, where spider webs hung like tattered banners. The air here was thick with the scent of mildew and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or old blood. Not literally, of course, but the feeling was identical. A place designed for gathering, now utterly abandoned, stripped bare of all warmth and purpose. I imagined rows of silent figures eating in despair, their gazes fixed on nothing. The thought made my stomach clench. My flashlight beam swept across the grim expanse, catching on an anomaly at the far end. A section of the wall, subtly different. The stone blocks here were slightly irregular, the mortar lines too precise, too fresh compared to the ancient, crumbling masonry around it. An architect's eye for detail, a blessing and a curse. This wasn't original construction. This was a cover-up. I ran my hand over the cool, rough surface. It felt solid, unyielding, but the subtle variations in temperature, the faint draft I could almost imagine, confirmed it. There was something behind this. I spent the next hour working with a grim determination I hadn't known I possessed. The stone groaned, shifted, and with a final, sickening crack, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway. The air that rushed out was stagnant, thick with a scent that was both earthy and metallic, like wet soil and old iron. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to seal it up and pretend I'd never found it. But the house wouldn't let me leave. It was a short, winding tunnel, leading into a small, circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house. The walls were rough, unadorned, but the center of the room held a terrifying tableau. Around the altar, on the rough floor, were scattered bones. Small, delicate, definitely not animal. My light scanned the walls. But it was the wooden chest tucked into a shallow recess that truly commanded my attention. It was old, bound with iron, and when I managed to force open the rusted latch, a cascade of brittle, yellowed parchments and leather-bound journals spilled out. I knelt, my hands trembling as I picked up the first journal. The script was archaic, faded ink on brittle pages, but the language, though formal, was undeniably English. I began to read, my eyes straining in the dim light. It started with a ledger, meticulously detailing harvests, land expansions, and the burgeoning wealth of the Blackwood family. Then the entries shifted. References to the benefactor, the keeper of the woods, and the great bargain. My fingers traced the words, my mind struggling to comprehend. The pact. It was all there, laid bare. Generations of my ancestors had traded the prosperity of Blackwood Manor, their very lives for... what? The chosen one. Elara's cryptic warnings, her desperate attempts to find answers, her sudden, brutal end. It all clicked into place with a horrifying finality. She wasn't just investigating a family history. He was trying to break a chain, a centuries-old curse. He was trying to free us, to free me. And the house, or whatever lurked within it, had stopped her. I wasn't just an heir. I was the next offering. The house wasn't a prison. It was a trap, baited with my own inheritance, and I had walked right into it, waiting for me. Fluorescent lights hummed a constant, sickly yellow, casting long, unmoving shadows from the sparse tables and chairs. The air hung thick with the smell of stale cleaning solution and something indefinably institutional. A scent that now felt like it was clinging to my very skin. I sat at a table by myself, pushing around the lukewarm, congealed slop on my plate with a plastic spoon. My appetite had vanished days ago, replaced by a churning in my gut that had nothing to do with hunger. The silence was the worst. There was the hum of the lights, the occasional clatter from the serving window, the shuffling of other occupants. At first, I dismissed it as the building settling, or my own frayed nerves playing tricks. Now, I wasn't so sure. I watched a colleague across the room, a man I barely knew, slowly chewing his food. His movements seemed off, too slow, too deliberate. Was he watching me? Was everyone? My eyes darted around, scanning faces, but they were all placid, distant. Or were they? A flicker at the edge of my vision. A tall, gaunt figure standing briefly behind a serving cart, then gone. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. Nothing. Just the cart. I spun around, chair scraping against the floor. No one. Just the empty space where the wall met the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the cage of my chest. I wiped a bead of sweat from my temple. This was it. This was the madness Elara had spoken of, the one that had consumed my ancestors. It was coming for me. They were accusatory now, sharp little barbs of sound. Weak. Foolish. You opened the door. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it did no good. The voices were inside my head, yet they felt like they were coming from outside, from the very air I breathed. They were everywhere. I stared at my plate, trying to anchor myself in the mundane reality of the food. But the slop on the plate seemed to writhe, the congealed surface shifting and reforming into grotesque faces, their mouths agape, screaming silent accusations. I gagged, pushing the plate away with a shudder. Then came the visual. It wasn't a flicker this time. It was a gradual, insidious shift. The mess hall, moments ago a dull, sterile space, began to warp. The fluorescent lights flickered, not in a mechanical fault, but with an unnatural, sickly pulse, casting the room in an oscillating gloom. The other occupants in the mess hall, the few I'd seen earlier, were gone. Vanished. In their place, seated at the tables, standing by the walls, were figures. They were indistinct at first, like old, faded photographs. But as I watched, horrified, they solidified. They were my ancestors. Elara, her face etched with a silent, desperate plea. My great-grandfather, his lips thin and disapproving. A collective guttural groan rose from them, a sound that resonated deep within my chest. My breath caught in my throat. The event. A woman, impossibly tall and skeletal, her face a mask of ancient sorrow, rose from a table directly in front of me. She wore a black, rustling gown that seemed to absorb the meager light. She glided towards me, not walking, but flowing, her feet never quite touching the floor. She stopped just inches away, her spectral face looming over mine. Him lips, cracked and dry, parted. The house. It was Elara, or a manifestation of her, twisted by whatever held her. It hungers for the mind. A jolt, like ice through my brain, paralyzed me. It was to feed it, to give it life. Your ancestors traded themselves, and now, it takes you. The true horror crashed over me. It wasn't just a curse, a legacy of madness. I wasn't just inheriting a house. I was the next meal, chosen, prepared, served. He had been trying to escape being consumed. The mess hall dissolved completely. They were not just victims. They were the chorus, bound to the entity, ensuring the next sacrifice. My own scream was lost in the din, a tiny, insignificant sound swallowed by the chorus of the damned. My grip on reality, already tenuous, finally snapped. My great-aunt Elara, she hadn't just been trying to warn me. He had been trying to fight it, and he had failed. The realization was a gut punch, cold and sickening, far worse than any physical blow. The thought echoed in the hollow space of my chest, a morbid litany. I was hunched over the last few pages of her journal, the thin, brittle paper feeling like a living thing in my trembling hands. The ink had bled in places, smeared by what I could only imagine were tears, or perhaps blood. Her handwriting, always elegant, had degenerated into a frantic scrawl, words tumbling over each other like stones down a hill. The clatter of unseen trays from a service hatch and the low murmur of distant voices were the only sounds, a sterile counterpoint to the storm raging inside me. They'd brought me here after the manor, after the woods. They'd just seen a man raving, clutching old papers. They hadn't seen it. This was the core, the terrible truth she'd been desperate to convey. It demands a new steward when the old one falters. But if the steward resists, if they try to break the pact, they become the sacrifice. My breath hitched. A steward, she explained, was meant to maintain the link, to feed the entity indirectly, a willing participant in its slow, creeping influence over the land and the family. But a sacrifice. Elara had tried to break the pact, I now understood. He had tried to starve it, to cut it off, and in doing so, he had condemned herself. And now, me. It clung to my skin, seeped into my bones. The hair on my arms stood on end. I glanced up, my eyes darting across the empty tables, the rows of bolted-down chairs. Nothing. Just the pale, sickly yellow light of the overhead panels. But the feeling. It was like being watched by something that wasn't just observing, but tasting the air around me. I forced my attention back to the notes. Elara's final entries were a desperate blueprint. A ritual. A counterpact, she called it. One designed not to feed, but to bind. To seal. The ink was thicker here, smudged with what I now recognized as dried blood. The heart of the pact, she'd written, lies in the oldest stone, beneath the hearth, where the first blood was spilt. It must be broken, not merely sealed. But the binding, it demands a new anchor, a living anchor, one who understands the price. my gaze unfocused, blurring the words. She meant herself. He had planned to sacrifice herself, not to the entity, but to the ritual, to become the final lock on its prison. But she'd failed. The entity had claimed her first. It was an absence of light, a place where the fluorescent glow seemed to bend and falter. It pulsed, a silent, ravenous beat. My stomach lurched. It was here, with me. Even in this sterile, supposedly safe environment, it was here. It had followed me. My hands shook so violently the journal rustled. Elara's plans. She'd meticulously detailed the components. Specific herbs, symbols carved into bone, a precise incantation in a language I didn't recognize, and a final, terrible act of self-severance. She'd tried to break the original compact, to prevent the entity from claiming me, her only living kin. She'd tried to save me. But the ritual was incomplete. The last page ended abruptly. A single smeared word that looked like failed. The rest was blank. No, not blank. There was a faint, almost invisible impression. A depression in the paper, as if something sharp and heavy had been pressed down, digging into the fibers. A symbol. Not one of Elara's carefully drawn sigils, but something else. A claw mark, perhaps. Or a finger. The distortion above the table rippled, growing larger, more defined. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. The temperature plummeted further. I could see my own breath, a faint mist in the stale air. You are the last. You are ready. Panic, raw and visceral, clawed its way up my throat. I was trapped. Trapped in this mess hall, trapped by the men in uniforms who thought I was mad, and trapped by an entity that had waited centuries for its next meal. She hadn't finished the ritual, but he had laid the groundwork. He had shown me the way. The price of the pact. It was blood. My blood, if I let it have its way. Or perhaps the blood of the entity itself, if I could find a way to complete what he had started. The thought was audacious, terrifying, and utterly desperate. I had to. I was trapped. Elara's failure screamed at me from the stained pages. I had to. The fluorescent lights hummed above, an irritating, sterile drone that felt utterly out of place against the ancient dread stirring in my gut. My hands, still trembling, clutched the journal, its brittle pages a desperate lifeline. The guards, two burly figures with impassive faces, watched me from across the room. Their eyes, devoid of understanding, only saw a man on the brink, muttering to himself in a locked-down mess hall. They didn't see the shadows lengthening in corners where no light could reach, or the way the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest. I forced my gaze back to Elara's scrawled script. The words were fractured, half-finished sentences, symbols I barely recognized. It was a language of fear and desperation, penned by a hand that had known the same icy grip I felt now. The binding, the veil, blood and bone. Only through severance. My eyes darted, trying to piece together the fragments of an ancient defense. I remembered her earlier notes, the ones detailing the entity's nature, its hunger, its connection to the land, to the house. It wasn't just in Blackwood Manor. It was Blackwood Manor, and its influence was stretching, reaching, even into this sterile, linoleum-floored prison. The stainless steel tables shimmered, their polished surfaces reflecting not the bland walls, but fleeting, skeletal branches. One of the guards shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly, probably at the sight of my contorted face. He said something into a small radio, his voice a muffled drone against the rising tide of internal chaos. I ignored him, pushing deeper into Elara's instructions. The paper itself felt alive in my hands, vibrating with a low thrum. Suddenly, A tray clattered to the floor from a stack on a nearby counter. It wasn't just a fall. It sounded like it had been thrown. The guards flinched, turning their heads sharply. They looked at me, then at the scattered metal, then back at me, suspicion hardening their features. "Hey!" one of them barked, taking a step forward. "What was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My focus was absolute, my mind racing to hold on to the thread of the ritual. The chairs, bolted to the floor, began to scrape. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. The guards, now clearly unnerved, exchanged wide-eyed glances. They saw the lights, they heard the groans, but they couldn't see it. Not like I could. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, growing in size, pushing against the mundane reality of the room. It wasn't a physical form with limbs or eyes, but a colossal, suffocating presence. It was pure, distilled hunger, an ancient, festering malevolence that had taken root in the world and now clawed its way into my sight. Its edges pulsed with faint greenish light, and within its churning depths, I saw fleeting images. A crumbling stone wall, a rotted tree, a pair of eyes that were not eyes, but pits of endless night. My mind screamed in protest, threatening to shatter under the weight of its revelation. And it was here, in the mess hall, manifesting its true, monstrous form, its full power unleashed against me. "Stop it! What are you doing?" the second guard yelled, pulling out a baton. He didn't understand. He couldn't. I pushed back, my voice ragged, fighting against the crushing pressure, against the invading despair. I bind you, I sever you," I chanted, my eyes fixed on Elara's notes, on the final, incomplete lines. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, a binding, a willing act of defiance. The entity roared, a soundless scream that vibrated through my skull, making my teeth ache. It was trying to break me, to consume my sanity before I could finish. My own mind was unraveling, the edges fraying, but a stubborn, primal will to survive, a desperate refusal to become another swallowed soul, held me together. The whispers, which had been a low hum, swelled into a roaring current, 1,000 overlapping voices screaming in a language I almost understood. It felt like my skull was a drum, beaten from the inside by invisible mallets. My focus, though, remained a razor-sharp point, cutting through the chaos. The air crackled, not with electricity, but with something far older, far more potent. It was the smell of ozone mixed with damp earth and something acrid, like burnt bone. The linoleum under my feet vibrated, a deep, unsettling thrum that resonated in my teeth. I felt a tearing sensation, deep within my chest, as if a vital thread was being ripped from my very core. The world blurred, colors bleeding into each other. The stark white of the walls, the institutional green of the floor, the sickly yellow of the flickering lights. All of it swirled into a vortex that threatened to drag me down. I gritted my teeth, digging my heels into the vibrating floor, desperate to anchor myself. This was the cost, I realized. The price of the pact, the final payment. It wasn't just blood. It was a piece of me. Then, in a single shattering instant, it was over. The noise vanished. The vibrations ceased. The acrid smell dissipated, leaving behind only the sterile tang of disinfectant. I stood there, swaying, my knees threatening to buckle, my hands still hovering over the completed sigil. I collapsed onto the cold floor, the impact jarring my already fragile frame. My head swam. My muscles screamed, not from exertion, but from a deeper systemic exhaustion that permeated every cell. It was the sound of 1,000 generations of fear, of secrets, of the terrible, binding promises made by my ancestors. I knew their names now, not just from the faded family tree, but from the raw, visceral understanding that had been forced into my mind during the ritual. I knew their desperation, their folly, their ultimate despair. The entity, whatever it truly was, had not merely been banished. It had been fed. And in feeding it, I had become part of its history, another link in the chain. It was a vacuum. Was it truly gone? Or merely dormant, satiated for a time, waiting to stir again when the hunger returned, when the next bloodline offered its tribute? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The house, Blackwood Manor, was silent. Yes, but it wasn't quiet. It hummed with a different energy now, a watchful stillness that felt far more menacing than the overt threats I'd faced before. I pushed myself up, slowly, painfully, my limbs stiff and unresponsive. My reflection in a nearby window showed a stranger. Gaunt, eyes wide and bloodshot, a fine tremor running through my hands. I looked like a man who had wrestled with something ancient and lost. And perhaps I had. The weight of it all settled upon me then. The lineage, the pact, the terrible knowledge. Blackwood Manor wasn't just an inheritance. It was a burden, a living monument to a curse. I had stepped into a prison, just as I'd feared, but it wasn't a prison of brick and mortar. It was a prison of blood, of memory, of an unspoken obligation. I walked to the door, my steps heavy, each one an effort. The lock, previously impenetrable, clicked open with a soft sigh. Freedom. But what kind of freedom? I was no longer bound by the immediate threat of the entity, but by the indelible mark it had left on my soul. Blackwood Manor could not remain. It was a wound on the earth, a beacon for things best left undisturbed. My ancestors had built it, maintained it, fed it. I would be the one to break the cycle. I would tear it down, every last stone, every rotting beam, until nothing remained but a scar on the land. It was the only way to ensure the entity, if it truly still lingered, had no home, no anchor, no connection to this world, or to my blood. My vision blurred, each flash a hammer blow against my retinas, leaving ghostly afterimages that danced in the rapidly shifting darkness. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical force, pressing in on my skull, vibrating through my teeth, rattling the very bones in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the light still penetrated, a crimson pulse behind my lids. My hands flew to my ears, pressing hard, trying to shut out the cacophony, but it was inside me, an echo chamber in my own head. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to break free from the invisible bonds that held me captive in that strobe-lit nightmare. But my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. There were faces in the flashes, blurred, indistinct, but they felt like eyes, watching, judging, waiting. Then, nothing. The next thing I knew, the air was still. No flickering lights, no screaming voices, just the sterile scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of distant machinery. My eyes fluttered open to a bland ceiling, a single steady fluorescent panel casting a uniform, unforgiving glow. My head ached, a dull, persistent throb behind my eyes, and my mouth felt like cotton. I was lying on a cot, a thin blanket pulled up to my chin. My clothes were different, a simple, loose-fitting tunic and trousers. I sat up slowly, my muscles stiff and protesting. The room was small, sparse. The cot, a metal nightstand, a locked door. No windows. How long had I been there? Days? Weeks? The memory of the mess hall was vivid, terrifying, but also distant, like a nightmare recalled just moments after waking. Had it been real? Or a final desperate collapse of my mind? I didn't know. I still don't. Eventually, they let me go. I don't remember the details of my release. Only a blur of paperwork, hushed conversations between officials, and the profound, disorienting sensation of stepping back into the harsh, indifferent light of the outside world. The first breath of fresh, unfiltered air tasted like freedom and ash. Blackwood Manor. The name itself felt like a weight, a physical ache in my chest. I couldn't go back there, not to live, but I couldn't just abandon it either. It was a wound, a festering legacy that demanded closure. I spent weeks, then months, navigating the legal labyrinth, arranging for its demolition. It wasn't easy. The manor was ancient, listed, but the local authorities, perhaps sensing the deep unease that clung to the property like a shroud, offered little resistance to its planned destruction. I didn't supervise the work myself. I couldn't. Instead, I hired a firm, gave them carte blanche, and waited for their reports. They sent me pictures, grainy images of crumbling stone, splintered timber, and then, finally, an empty, scarred patch of earth. They told me they'd had trouble with the foundations, that the ground beneath the oldest wing was unusually resistant, almost as if it didn't want to yield. I just told them to keep digging, to break it all apart, to salt the earth if they had to. I tried to rebuild my life. I moved to a different city, one where the air tasted of exhaust fumes and concrete, not damp earth and ancient pine. I found work, designing sleek, modern structures that were the antithesis of Blackwood Manor. I dated, I laughed, I even managed to sleep through the night sometimes. It was too quiet. They were quieter now, certainly. A faint echo, a phantom itch at the back of my mind. It was never distinct enough to be real, never loud enough to be anything but a trick of memory, a phantom limb of my fractured sanity. But I knew it was still there. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't bound by stone and mortar. It wasn't contained by the physical destruction of its ancient vessel. It was a force, a hunger, a stain on the very fabric of the world, and I, Grant, was now intimately, irrevocably linked to it. The manor was gone, but the roots of that terrible pact, the unbroken cycle of my family's madness and sacrifice, had burrowed deep into my own psyche. A scent, fleeting and almost imperceptible, of damp earth and pine needles would waft through the air, even on the highest floor of my sterile building. It was something subtler, more insidious, a quiet certainty that I was being watched, an almost imperceptible pressure on the edges of my awareness. The entity's influence wasn't severed. It had merely receded, like a tide pulling back from the shore, waiting for its moment to return. I was its legacy now, its unwilling heir.